of all, I want to show one short clip with you all. This clip taken on commencement at Oral-Roberts University, which is Christian school. So let us watch first. They praise God before they receive the degree. All my life have been faithful, all my life have been so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing the goodness of God. Of course, I do not know them, but I am sure that God had a plan for them. God lead them according to God's perfect plan. They might be struggling while they're studying. Nevertheless, God's faithfulness was with them. So while I was watching this clip, it reminded me of our Christian life. Yes, God has a plan for us. God has a plan for us. His goodness and faithfulness always follows us in God's plan. Therefore, we should trust God's plan. Do you agree? Yes. Yeah. Especially today, we can find God's plan through this passage. So let us meditate on God and His plan through this passage. So let us read Jeremiah chapter 29 and verse 11 one more time together. Ready, go. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and hope. To begin with, let us find out the background of the passage today. Especially, we should first remember the purpose of the book of Jeremiah. The purpose of the book of Jeremiah. To be specific, the prophet Jeremiah, he wrote a letter to the Israelites in order to encourage them and trust God's promise in their circumstance. In other words, God promised the restoration and the blessing to the Israelites who were in exile. One more time, God promised the restoration and the blessing to the Israelites, the people of Israel who were in exile. Therefore, we should first understand the Israelites' circumstance. So what happened to them? What happened to them? For example, let us read Jeremiah chapter 29 and verse 1. Ready, go. These are the words of the letter that Jeremiah the prophet sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders of the exiles, and to the priests, the prophets, and all the people who Nebuchadnezzar had taken into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Unfortunately, the Israelites had to exile in Babylon. To be specific, the Israelites had sinned against God. They sinned against God and they disobeyed God's words. Therefore, God gave them a punishment and sent them exile into Babylon. As you can see on the map here, the Israelites were supposed to live in Jerusalem. However, God commanded exile as a punishment for the Israelites. Therefore, the Israelites had to suffer and live into Babylon. However, God did not forget His people. Therefore, God used the prophet Jeremiah in order to encourage them. In other words, God promised to the Israelites through the letter of the prophet Jeremiah. So let us read Jeremiah chapter 29 and verse 10. Ready, go. For thus said the Lord, when 70 years are complete for Babylon, I will visit you and I will fulfill to you my promise and bring you back to this place. Likewise, God promised the Israelites to bring them back to Jerusalem. However, they had to live as exile for 70 years. 70 years. In other words, God had a long-term plan for the Israelites. God had a long-term plan for the Israelites. 70 years. So the Israelites, they had to stay until they complete the exile for 70 years in Babylon. Can you imagine? The Israelites had to live with suffering Babylon for 70 years. However, also there was a problem with the Israelites. To be specific, at the time, they were the first prophet who taught wrong to the Israelites. For example, let us read Jeremiah chapter 29 and verse 9. Ready, go. For it is a lie that they are professing to you in my name. I did not send them, declares the Lord. Unfortunately, they are first prophets who told a lie to the Israelites. Especially the first prophets taught that their exile duration will be shorter than 70 years. Shorter than 70 years. It was completely opposite of God's plan. Of course, the Israelites, they also wanted to go back to their home, Jerusalem, as soon as possible. Also, they did not understand God, who promised them for 70 years. To be specific, it was too much painful plan. It was too much painful plan according to the perspective of man. If I were Israelites, 70 years would be too much, right? Nevertheless, God decided to set a time for the Israelites. In other words, the Israelites had to live there for 70 years. For example, let us read Jeremiah chapter 29 and verse 5 to 6. Ready, go. Build house and live in them. Plant gardens and so produce. Verse 9. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives from your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. Likewise, the Israelites, they had to live there according to God's plan. Of course, it might be tough and not easy to live there for 70 years according to the perspective of man. However, it was God's perfect plan for the Israelites. To be specific, God had the purpose of His plan. So what is the purpose of God? Especially we can find the purpose of God through today's passage. So let us read Jeremiah chapter 29 and verse 11 once again. Ready, go. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. First of all, let us remember God's plan once again. For I know the plans I have for you. So what is God's plan? Yes, it was a 70 years of exile in Babylon for the Israelites, 70 years. Especially Jeremiah, he also mentioned the purpose of God's plan. So let us read verse 11 one more time together. Ready, go. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. Yes, God promised to give welfare, future, and hope. Welfare, future, and hope to the Israelites. Especially when Jeremiah used the word welfare, he used Hebrew term shalom. He used the Hebrew term shalom. Also, shalom refers to peace. Can you say it together? Peace. Likewise, God promised to give His peace while they're in exile and after the exile. Yes, His peace, God's peace, could help the Israelites overcome their troubles in exile. Also, God promised to take care of the Israelites while they're in exile. In other words, God never abandoned the Israelites. God never abandoned the Israelites. Therefore, God promised to give new hope to the Israelites who are hopeless in exile. Furthermore, future and hope refers to restoration for the Israelites physically and spiritually. To be specific, God promised to bring the Israelites back to Jerusalem after 70 years according to God's plan. Likewise, God promised to give His blessing to the Israelites in His plan. God promised to give blessing to the Israelites in His plan. Therefore, 70 years was not in vain, but rather it was worth it. One more time. Therefore, 70 years was not in vain, but rather it was worth it. So Jeremiah, he encouraged Israelites to wait on the Lord and trust in God's plan, not their own plans. In other words, Jeremiah encouraged Israelites to trust God's will, God's plan. Yes, God had a perfect plan for the Israelites. However, God did not just promise blessing to the Israelites. To be specific, the Israelites, they needed to take action in order to receive God's blessing while they're in exile. In other words, the Israelites should not just wait to receive God's blessing. So what is the action? So let us read Jeremiah chapter 29 and verse 12. Ready, go. Then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, I will hear you. Yes, the Israelites, they had to pray to God in their circumstance. In other words, God wanted the fervent prayer, not the complaining of their exile. To be specific, God wants them to come to the temple of God in order to worship and pray to God while they're in exile. Since God will answer and God will give His blessing to them. Therefore, God wanted the Israelites to stand firm by prayer in exile. So today, we meditate on God's plan for the Israelites. In other words, God promised to bless and restore the Israelites from exile according to God's plan. However, this God's plan did not end yet, since it is for us who are struggling with troubles in our lives. Trust God's plan. Can you say it together? Trust God's plan. Yes, we should trust God's plan once again. Especially, we should trust God's perfect plan for us. Of course, the Israelites, they wanted to short time of waiting as the first prophets taught them. Also, they wanted to go back to Jerusalem as soon as possible according to their plans. However, God had perfect plan for them. The Israelites, they had to wait for 70 years in exile. Especially God made the Israelites stronger while they are in exile. One more time, God made the Israelites stronger while they are in exile. So God encouraged them to seek the Lord. Therefore, God appointed 70 years for the Israelites according to God's perfect plan. In the same way, we should trust God's perfect plan for our lives. Of course, God also works according to our plans in life away. However, God has another perfect plan for us in our lives as well. So I have one question. Have you ever experienced of delay, wait, or change plans? For example, I want to share my story again. As I shared the video clip in the beginning, I also graduated from Moody Theological Seminary last May in 2021. Especially when I was studying at Seminary in Chicago, there was a financial issue, so I thought it would be better to study online back in Korea. Therefore, I decided to lay down everything, so I came back to Korea last 2019. However, it did not go well according to my plan. My plan was to finish studying online for one more semester, but it did not go well, and it took 2 years, and I had to serve ministry while I was here in Korea. Yes, God delayed my plans. However, it was a perfect time for me. So while I was studying online here in Korea, I had a chance to serve a mega church, Hansen and Coming Church here in Korea. Especially it helped me to prepare for church planting for Ordinary Church. Also had a privilege to be ordained from Christian Mission Alliance denomination right after graduating. Of course, it took years. It took many years after I served at the church in Chicago here in Korea. But it was a long journey, but it was worth it. Yes, God's plan was perfect for me. Of course, I'm still worried about my future and my ministry. However, I strongly believe that God holds my future. The reason why I share my story because God has a perfect plan for us. Even though it took a long time or delay, God is still faithful to us. Especially God, as God promised a future to the Israelites in the passage today, God holds our future. Can you say it together? God holds our future. Therefore, we sing praise today. Because He lives, I can face tomorrow. Because He lives, our fear is gone. Because I know He holds the future, and life is worth the living just because He lives. Because I know He holds the future. Yes, God holds our future. God has a perfect plan for us. Therefore, we only need to trust God's plan. For example, I saw one Instagram post from Christine Kane, who is Australian Christian author, and she encouraged believers who are fearful. Why don't we read it together? Ready, go. While you're waiting for the answer from God in one area of your life, Don't put all the other areas of hope. Watch for where God is giving you direction and go with that. Trust Him with the stuff that is still unanswered and keep moving forward. He knows what we don't. Do you agree? Likewise, encourage believers to trust God, His plan, while they are waiting on God. Likewise, we only need to trust God's plan once again. However, we are weak in our circumstance. Therefore, God also promised to us to give His welfare, peace, shalom in our lives. In other words, God will continue to give His peace, shalom in our circumstance. No matter how fear and struggling with our circumstance, God will give His peace, shalom. Especially Jesus also came to give His peace. Can you say together? Peace be with you. Peace be with you. Can you say each other? Ready, go? Peace be with you. Yeah, Jesus always welcomes and gives His peace to His people who are fearful. In the same way, His peace dwells in our lives. Therefore, we should not fear our troubles since God gives His peace. Also, we should pray to God in order to accomplish God's plan. As God encourages Israelites to pray to God, God also wants us to pray to God once again. Especially, you can find one person who also prayed to God in the Old Testament. For example, let us read the book of Daniel chapter 9 and verse 4. Ready, go. I prayed to the Lord my God and made confession, saying, O Lord, the great and awesome God, who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love Him and keep His commandments. At the time, Daniel, he also prayed to God, who would keep His covenant a promise for His people. Likewise, Daniel, he did not give up or later. He decided to seek the Lord in his troubles. In the same way, we should continue to pray to God in our circumstances. Especially, God will also bless us as He did to the Israelites. Therefore, we should never stop praying to God. Even though we do not understand God's plan, or we are struggling, or we are waiting, our first priority is prayer, nothing else. Our first priority is prayer, nothing else. Trust God's plan. God holds our future. Shalom. Pray first. God, can you say together? Trust God's plan. God holds our future. Shalom. Pray first. God. Amen.